In the last 15 years, nearly 100 prisoners serving life sentences have been released from prison, only to go on and commit another violent crime. Sometimes, even murder. It is the job of the parole board and the probation service to determine whether prisoners can be safely released into the community and not reoffend. They don't always get it right.
We blame the justice system and the parole board. If anyone actually understood, then they'd do an awful lot more to prevent this from happening.
How is he allowed to do this again?
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and thank you very much for joining me here again today. Today we are talking about a suggested case, so thank you as always. But before we hop into today's case, last week we spoke about the case of Jerobian van Wyk, and he was murdered all over a mango. But if you haven't watched that case, I will link it up here for you. It is quite upsetting, so just a heads up. But today we're going to talk about a case where it shows that if the law as a whole does not really follow up on its perpetrators and does not really take the perpetrators or the crime as seriously as they should, how it could escalate later on and affect a lot more people, and how if they only had stopped the perpetrator then, sentenced them to a longer sentence, how it all could have been prevented. But with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today we are heading to the outstanding KwaZulu-Natal and all the beauty that it has to offer. Here lives a young, seemingly normal family consisting of mom, dad, and 3 children. Sadly, one of the children who were raised in the Julyan family would turn out to be a rotten seed. Wesley Julyan was born in South Africa in 1986 and by all accounts had a normal childhood, one of ups and downs, homework and playdates. He had 2 siblings, a brother and a sister, and was quite close to his parents as far as I could read. Wesley seemed to be a bit of a party boy as he grew up, but that is not out of the norm for teenagers exploring new things. So when Wesley was 18 years old in 2003, this is where things start to take a very weird turn. What he went on to do may have been something that he's always wanted to do, and he just felt that this was the opportunity and the best way to do it. But let's get into exactly what I mean. Then, on the 28th of February 2003, 2 young men then headed out for a night of partying in the Mthwalume area. Here, they would bar hop, club hop, and just have a really fun Saturday night. These 2 men were 21-year-old Jaco Strauss and 18-year-old Wesley Julyan. Now, these guys were firstly drink driving. They started drinking quite early into their club/pub hopping, and there were some reports that they were not only drinking, but that they were also taking some dagga or smoking dagga, and also taking some ecstasy apparently. So these guys were completely out of it in one way or another. But like I said earlier, they were driving themselves around, which is obviously a do not do. But while they were busy driving themselves around, close to midnight, they had left some of the bars and they were heading back to Wesley's home, where it seemed as though their car broke down that they were using that night. And it is unclear whether the car broke down because it ran out of petrol or if there was some mechanical issue with the car. However, they did break down and pull over to the side of the road a few kilometers away from a petrol station. So Wesley and Jaco then decided to get out and walk towards this petrol station to get help or to get petrol. But once the 2 men then got to the petrol station, they then walked to the guy behind the counter inside the little store, and they started asking him about if he knew anyone who could help them fix a car or if they could get a taxi. And while they were busy talking to this guy behind the counter, an older gentleman then overheard their conversation, and he then offered to help. And this older gentleman, he was 51-year-old Kenneth van Aert. And Kenneth was there because he was grabbing a few things from the shop at the little petrol station when he overheard the 2 guys talking about the car. So Kenneth then offered the 2 boys a lift back home to Wesley's place in Mthwalume, where Wesley then stayed with his parents, brother and sister. The area where Wesley stayed, his house was quite on an undeveloped area, so his house then had quite a large plot of undeveloped land. So Kenneth then continued to pay for his stuff, and then the 3 of them then headed out and went into Kenneth's car. Kenneth at the time was driving a Ford Icon, and while Kenneth and the 2 boys were in the car, Kenneth then said to them, I'm really enjoying your company, would you mind if we maybe go grab something to drink? So the 2 guys were then like, oh yeah, that's definitely something we're into. So they then headed to the social club, which was near where Wesley's home was. So the three of them then pile into the bar and they start heavily drinking. But later on, there would be some testimony that apparently at this time, Kenneth was really wasted. So apparently Wesley and Yaku had to help Kenneth into his own car. Now, it's not like they were all sober or one of them was sober in the group. They were all different levels of drunk. So they all kind of stood at each other at the car and they were like, okay, you seem a bit less drunk than the other. So they then pointed at Yaku, who then was the designated driver of the night. So Yaku then gets into Kenneth's car. He's now in the driver's seat. Kenneth is now in the passenger seat. And then Wesley is now behind Kenneth in the back. Now, this is where it all seems to get quite blurry and where it kind of became a he said, she said situation. For some reason, while driving down an open road, Wesley then piped up and said, "Yep, I'm going to strangle Kenneth right here and right now." So at first, Yaku was quite taken aback. Remember, he was the one driving and Wesley was behind Kenneth in the passenger seat. So Yaku was quite taken aback, but he didn't take things too seriously because, like he said, Wesley was very drunk, allegedly. But then Yaku started taking it quite seriously when he noticed that Wesley's arm then came over the passenger seat and he now had his arm around Kenneth's neck. So Yaku then started to panic and then he started slowing down, eventually coming to a stop and pulling over on the side of the road, where he then said he got out of the car in absolute disgust and he started pacing around the car until he then heard Wesley shout, "I need your shoelace, it's not working." So apparently Wesley was now struggling to strangle Kenneth in the passenger seat. He couldn't get a really good angle apparently to strangle him. So he then asked for Yaku's shoelace, where he then obliged, took off his shoelace and then gave it to Wesley. But Yaku would say that he only obliged because he was just in absolute shock. Wesley then continued to strangle Kenneth with the shoelace and Yaku then watched the life drain out of Kenneth's face. Wesley then instructed Yaku to see if there was any pulse with Kenneth around his neck area, and Yaku said he could feel nothing and Kenneth was dead. Now, allegedly, during the testimony that would take place later on, Yaku apparently then turned to Wesley, who was still in the passenger seat, and said, "Do you know what you've just done?" And Wesley was apparently just like, "Yeah, so what?" Allegedly, though. So Yaku was just looking at him in absolute disbelief, but Yaku then eventually snapped out of it and then decided to drive home, back to Wesley's family's home. When Wesley and Yaku then got back to Wesley's family's home, they then dragged Kenneth out of the car and dragged him to an open area within the plot of land that Wesley owned, and they basically just left him there for a little while. They stared at him, and then Wesley quickly ran back into the house. He then grabbed some cling wrap, and he then decided to put this around and around Kenneth's face, specifically covering his nose and his mouth. Once they were done with this, they then decided to put branches and sand and debris, whatever they could find, over Kenneth's body. They then went inside and slept. When the boys got up the next morning, they then decided to drive Kenneth's car all the way back to Durban, where it was around 90 kilometers away, where they tried to then sell his car. They were quite unsuccessful. They weren't able to just randomly sell a car. So they then drove it all the way back and just left it abandoned in an open plot of land. When Wesley and Yaku then got back to Wesley's family's home, they then decided to now bury the body. So they then dug a hole and they then rolled Kenneth into this dug hole. And they then stood on top of the makeshift grave to flatten out the dirt and the earth to try and look as undisturbed as possible. They threw some leaves on, some sticks on, and just left him there. Now we have to remember that Kenneth was at this petrol station running a few errands or just getting small things for his house. And he was around 51 years old at the time. He did have a wife. So when Kenneth's wife woke up the next morning and noticed that her husband wasn't there, she called police immediately to report him missing. So because Kenneth was reported missing, the police did ask Kenneth's wife for any information about him, what he was wearing, what he drove. So she did give the registration number for the car, and eventually the car was found, but it was completely abandoned, and it seemed like whoever was using it had wiped down the car completely. So this car really didn't give any evidence or any more evidence that would point to where Kenneth was. It seemed like he just left his car there, got out, and disappeared. So for 2 months, Sharon van Aert, Kenneth's wife, didn't know anything about what had happened to her husband. She knew that one night 2 months ago, he left to go and get a few things from the corner store, and he never came home. But what happened to Kenneth and how it would be found out is so bizarre and such a roundabout way of getting to how Kenneth was murdered that if it didn't happen in these exact steps, I don't think that he would have ever been found. A couple months before Kenneth's murder and before this whole night out of boozing and partying with Wesley and Yaku, apparently Yaku had a friend who lived in the UK. So Yaku's friend who lived in the UK and his wife were going to come down to South Africa for a holiday, but unfortunately Yaku's friend was unable to make it because of some other obligations, but Yaku's friend said that his wife must just come down because she really wanted to come to South Africa. So Yaku then met up with his friend's wife at the airport. They then spent some time together. Yaku showed her South Africa. He also showed her a bit more, and they then had an affair. Now, the reason that this is so important is because once she then left to go back to the UK, they then continued their conversation and all seemed normal. They were flirting, they were talking up until the 28th of February or the morning of the 1st of March, when Kenneth was murdered. And after this, she said that Yaku was just completely different. He was very dark. And eventually, between the 2nd and the 3rd of March 2003, he then confessed to exactly what he was involved in with Kenneth. So apparently, when Yaku confessed to this lady in the UK, he was busy texting it all to her. She was quite disturbed by this, so then she went to the UK police. The UK police then informed Interpol about what was happening back in South Africa, and then Interpol informed South Africa about what had happened. So police then came knocking on Yaku's door. They then arrested him, brought him in for questioning, as well as Wesley. So while being arrested, Yaku said that he would then enter a plea deal in order to give up a whole lot of evidence about what Wesley did that night. However, when Wesley was brought in for questioning, he turned the tables and he said it was all Yaku's thing. He was the one who did everything to Kenneth. And Wesley said that Yaku instructed him to do exactly what he told him to do, and by doing this, he would then give him 10,000 rand. And all Wesley had to do was apparently just hold Kenneth down in the passenger seat once they came to a stop. And it was Yaku who actually strangled Kenneth with a shoelace. But the cops didn't exactly buy the whole innocence thing, but the case was incredibly circumstantial because they really couldn't prove who did what in the vehicle. The car had been wiped down, the shoelace was not found, or it had been cleaned, or they don't actually know which pair of shoes Yaku or Wesley actually used. So both men were taken to trial and both men were put up for murder of Kenneth. And eventually, both Wesley and Yaku were found guilty for murder. And Yaku Strauss was sentenced to 15 years for his part in the murder, and Wesley was only sentenced to 13 years. And the reason that he was only sentenced to 13 years was because his defense said that he was just 18 years old, he was quite young, and he could be molded into the better citizen as he got older. And also, apparently, his defense took him to some type of psychiatric testing where they found that he was not capable of standing trial, even though he stood trial, and the judge did believe that he had some sort of bipolar disorder or some type of personality disorder. But later on in the trial, because of Kenneth's family, the sentencing would be looked at again, and eventually Wesley would be sentenced to 20 years behind bars. And you think we're done there? We're not even close. So a few years would go by. 2009 would now roll on, and remember the murder took place in 2003. So around 5.5 to 6 years later, after the murder, Wesley Julyan was now released, and a year later, Yaku Strauss would be released. So Wesley only served around 5 years in prison, and Yaku would only serve 6 years in prison. But apparently, Yaku and Wesley would not really talk at all after they had been released from prison, and they would just go on their separate ways and live their own lives. Apparently, once Yaku was released from prison, he became a devoted man of God and he served the church. But what really stood out in trial was that Wesley was not remorseful at all for what happened to Kenneth. It didn't look like he felt bad at all, but Yaku was incredibly remorseful. He was very sad about what had taken place and he felt really guilty, apparently. But Wesley, like we said, completely moved on. And sadly for the Julyan family, after Wesley was released, sadly their mother did pass away. So now it was just Wesley's father and his brother and sister. Once Wesley's mother had passed away, Wesley's father then moved to an area called Plettenberg Bay, where he then lived by himself. He just wanted to be alone and he just wanted some quiet. After Wesley was released, his brother Jeffrey also then went on to marry, and they then had a child together. Jeffrey and his wife Leanne had a child together named Ethan, and Leanne from a previous marriage had a daughter, and her name was Kayla. Leanne, Jeffrey, Ethan, and Kayla lived in a house with Leanne's father named Peter. So let's get back to Wesley. And while his brother was married and started his own family, Wesley actually stayed in the family home. Remember where they buried Kenneth? So he stayed there, but eventually he would actually have to move out because his father said that he was going to now sell this place. So they were in the process of selling the home, and there was a lot of furniture in there that was being discussed where it was going to go. And apparently, while Wesley was out, he was out of the house, Jeffrey, his brother, came into the house and took some furniture without Wesley's consent or without him knowing, even though they all had keys and even though this was a family home. But when Wesley got home, he noticed the missing furniture. He immediately called up his brother and said, "Where's my furniture? You've been talking about taking it. Now you take it. What the hell is going on?" basically. And Jeffrey and Wesley then got into a massive fight and they were arguing and going on and on about this furniture. And then Jeffrey then decided to actually just bring this furniture back because he was done with the whole arguing about this again and again. So Jeffrey then loaded up the bakkie with the help of his father-in-law, Peter, remember who he stayed with his wife and 2 children. They then loaded up the bakkie with the furniture inside because Peter was going to help him. And because it was school holidays, the children then got into the bakkie as well, and they all then headed over to Wesley or the family home. Okay, so where we left off, I apologize for the noise. Firstly, there's neighbors mowing their lawns. I had to put the fan on because it's getting very hot in this room and the camera's overheating, so I apologize. So Jeffrey and his father-in-law Peter are now in the bakkie with his 2 children. They are now heading over to Wesley, basically in the family home. Now, that same day that Jeffrey was going to drop off the furniture pieces, he was also due to fetch his wife, Leanne, at 4:45 that evening from work. And 4:45 came and went, and there was absolutely no sign of Jeffrey. So Leanne knew that something was fishy instantly because she said that Jeffrey was an incredibly reliable man and that he was always on time, and if he wasn't, he would let her know. But Leanne thought, okay, maybe don't stress too much about it. Maybe he got busy or he got distracted, and she found her own way home. But once Leanne got home later that evening, she noticed that there was nobody in the house. Her dad wasn't there, her son wasn't there, her daughter wasn't there, and her husband wasn't there. So she then called all of them, and no one answered. Then later on in the evening, as it got even darker, Leanne then received an absolutely horrifying call, and she was told that her Mtwalume house that she shared with Jeffrey and Wesley and also their sister was now completely engulfed in flames. And the people who called her to let her know that their house was engulfed in flames was actually their neighbors who lived next to the house where Wesley stayed. So Leanne panics and she then heads over to the home, where she then sees a horde of policemen, firemen, and people all gathered around the driveway of this home. The firemen then come straight up to Leanne and they tell her some really heartbreaking news. Once the firemen were actually able to walk through the home and it was now safe, they noticed, sadly, that there were 4 bodies located inside the home and that there was only 1 survivor. So sadly, the firemen then told Leanne that her 9-year-old son, Ethan, her 16-year-old daughter, Kayla, her 72-year-old father, Peter, and her 34-year-old husband, Jeffrey, had all passed away in the fire. The only survivor was Wesley. The firemen then went on to say that they all kind of just fell asleep and they then passed away in the fire. Leanne stopped and she looked at the firemen then and she said, "What? They were all asleep?" And she knew instantly that this was not right, and she told the police and she told the firemen that it must be impossible that they fell asleep. They were here to drop off some furniture and he was supposed to pick me up at 4:45. Why would he fall asleep in the middle of the afternoon? They also don't live there, so why would they be sleeping in the bed when the family had a home a couple of kilometers away? But modern science and medicine is an incredible thing, and police and pathologists were able to determine that actually the 4 victims did not pass away from smoke inhalation. Apparently, all 4 victims had been strangled to death at some point. It was apparent by police findings that Jeffrey had been murdered first. Apparently, Jeffrey was taken by surprise and hit in the back of the head with a pickaxe. A rope was then thrown over Jeffrey's neck and he was then strangled to death. The next victim was 72-year-old Peter, who was Leanne's father, and he was also taken by surprise and strangled with a makeshift copper rope, which means that it must have been incredibly painful, incredibly brutal death, because these thin wires would have just sliced through his skin, almost decapitating the 72-year-old man. Next, it seems that Kayla was the next victim, and she was then strangled with a dog collar. And then the last victim was young Ethan, who seemed to have been strangled with a rope or some kind of ligature as well, but it seems to have been burnt away in the fire. Once all 4 people had been murdered, it seemed that they were then all dragged to different beds in the house, where they were then presumed to be sleeping by the firemen because they were all in different beds. So when firemen saw Wesley as the only survivor, he was coughing, he was spewing a lot of spit and snot because he was assumed to have been a survivor of the fire. So paramedics then put him into the back of their van. They took him to the hospital to treat him for smoke inhalation, but he was released the next day. And as soon as he was released, he was then taken to the police station for questioning. And Wesley said that he had no idea what happened. He said that when he got to the house, because he wasn't there the entire time, when he got to the house was already set alight. It was flaming. It was so hot. And the reason that he had smoke inhalation was that he tried to run inside, but it was blistering his skin. It was burning him, and he had to then run back out. And when Wesley was asked by police, but why didn't you call fire and rescue? Why didn't you call paramedics? Why didn't you let anyone know that there were people in there? Wesley said that firstly, he didn't know that there was anyone in the house when he got there. And secondly, because the house was surrounded by so many neighbors, they were trying to put out the flames, that he assumed that someone had already called the police, which is a fair enough statement in some sense, because we've seen in a case that we've done before where bystanders would assume that that one called the police or that one called the police. Meanwhile, no one has, because they all assume that someone else did, which is known as the bystander effect. But on the 28th of December 2017, the family was laid to rest. And after the funeral, Wesley then moved in with his dad in Platte. But once Wesley moved away, the case was still ongoing. It wasn't the end of the case just because Wesley proclaimed his innocence. So the police were still doing their investigations, and they could actually prove that Wesley was actually at the house when Jeffrey and his family came there at first, and also when the house was set up in flames. And they could see this because of Wesley's phone records. And you may say yes, but he could have maybe left his phone at home, and that's why he wasn't pinging from any other towers. However, they did think about this, and they also found that he was actually texting his girlfriend, who lived in America at the time, and while he was texting her, there were indications off the phone towers to show that he was in that specific location. So then, just a few days before Wesley's 33rd birthday, he was arrested in Plettenberg Bay at his dad's house. Wesley pleaded not guilty, but the trial went ahead. This case was difficult to prove because it was so circumstantial. No one actually saw the family being murdered, or that Wesley was actually the person who set the house alight. However, there were neighbors who were first at the scene, and they said that they saw Wesley there at the fire acting incredibly strangely. He was pacing, he was mumbling, and he was just coughing and everything, even though he was outside of the house. And there was one article that said that apparently Wesley even cut the hose pipe of one of the neighbors who was trying to hose out the fire, but that was only in one article and very alleged. So the prosecution believed that this was all over the furniture that Wesley felt that Jeffrey took from him without his consent, and that they had been fighting for quite a while, and it escalated when Jeffrey was there in person. So they assumed that Wesley became pissed off and that he hit Jeffrey with the pickaxe. And when Wesley now realized that Jeffrey was dead, he assumed that he had to kill everyone because he would never be able to explain what he had done. And the reason that he set the house alight was because he needed a way out, and he also needed to hide evidence, apparently. And why Wesley's story about him coming home and noticing the fire and not knowing that anyone was there was being chewed into pieces by the prosecution is because police found Jeffrey's car keys in Wesley's pocket the night that the house was alight. And that really hurts Wesley's case, because if he didn't know that his brother and his family was there, why would he have his brother's car keys if he was never there the entire time that his brother was? But apparently the prosecution assumed that the reason that he had his brother's car keys in his pocket was because he had murdered his family, apparently, set the house alight, apparently, then was going to make a quick getaway in the vehicle when he quickly then texted his girlfriend in the US about the fact that his house was on fire and there was this whole tragedy going on, and he was trying to make a quick escape with the vehicle. But this was all dashed when his neighbors started running towards the house trying to fix the problem. And apparently during trial, Wesley said that he felt a lot of pressure from his girlfriend in the US because she was saying that he needed to get back the furniture from his brother Jeffrey, because when she comes back to South Africa, they want to now move in together and she wants the furniture that was in the house. And that's why they were so desperate to get it back. During the trial, Wesley was very theatrical, he was mumbling, laughing, and when asked a question, he would answer with a question. But in February 2019, Wesley Julyan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 4 life sentences and an additional 5 years for arson. So, with ending this whole case, I want to know, do you think that Wesley Julyan was actually guilty of murdering 4 people in this house? There was one person who murdered 4. 2 adult men and 2 children. It is possible that Wesley may have locked the children into different rooms and then got to them as he got to them. And like police suggested, he may have gotten to Jeffrey as a complete surprise. So Jeffrey was hit in the back of the head with a pickaxe. So that is why he may have been able to take down his older brother. And with 72-year-old Peter, he may have overpowered him, being quite a young man. But do you think it's plausible? Do you think Wesley acted with another person? Or do you think he's not guilty, or is he guilty? Because this case has no hard facts, but an incredibly large amount of circumstantial evidence. But with that being said, let me know what you think of this case down below. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend further. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.